I have been lazing off for quite a while, but I'm going to start this because I'm kind of kicking myself, and it is nothing but quarantine. The goal of what I'm trying to accomplish is to just read a lot of historical feminist texts and also anti-feminist texts and compare them with the present day, as well as other books, because I know a lot of people don't have easy access or just don't have time to read this information, and it is incredibly important. The first document I'm going over is the Deceleration of Sentiments. Just going over the original document, it gets pretty much straight to business. It's not really around the bush. It doesn't beat around the bush, that is. It goes directly into stating in the opening paragraphs, because it's not very long, that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of the man toward the woman, having an indirect object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. I want to at least mention that because ultimately there are a lot of varying degrees of people who seem to think that feminism and patriarchy theory and what that all means doesn't mean all men, or doesn't mean masculinity, or doesn't mean traditional masculinity. This is objectively stating that all of male history, the entirety of male history, is a tyranny against the female. That is what they believed the world was. That is how they allocated themselves. That's what they thought of people around them. That's what they thought of the men around them. And let's look at their facts, which are even more juicy. For the first vid, I am going to specifically be ignoring the vote because I want to do a entirely separate video or upload just for the vote, not even for any of the other things that they're complaining about, because one of the issues I have with people who complain about feminism is they often think it's just the vote, and then they kind of scapegoat over everything else that they talk about. So I'm going to specifically focus on everything else that they say outside the vote, and then I'll upload something completely different for the vote itself. Point 3 being, he has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. I don't know if I can really reply too much to that because it's not really a fact. It's hardly much of anything. It's kind of more of a euphemism. It seems like they just don't like anyone who's not white, which is kind of strange. But moving on. I am skipping over point 4 in the sentiments because that is also largely tied to the vote, and going straight to 5, which is, he has made her, if married in the eyes of the law, civilly dead. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. Women had a ton of rights in marriage. The sentiments itself doesn't exactly get into them, but women can sue their husbands for maintenance. Women have rights of, as it goes on in the further declaration of sentiments, impunity from crimes. I don't know how she's civilly dead and still able to collect money by law from her husband. This is next point, point 7. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. To the beginning of that, that's kind of an odd thing, right? I kind of want to juxtapose the she can commit many crimes with impunity with she's being held in a tyranny. That is utterly ridiculous. I want to stress how silly it is. Imagine somebody in 1800s who's black who's saying, I'm being oppressed because I'm being made a morally irresponsible being by not being taken to jail when I commit crimes. That seems rather ridiculous. I don't think it really gets into this specifically, but I do believe that the provided they be done in the presence of her husband basically means that her husband is the one taken to jail. So to even further expand on it, when, say, the slave commits a crime, she gets impunity, and the slave master, with the abject tyranny over her, is the one who's taken to prison. That seems like a very wonky way of trying to control women. I don't know. I mean, if men are pretty direct, they're pretty blunt. If that was a reality, that was a true reality for women at the time, that they were oppressed because they were given impunity for committing crimes. If men really wanted to tyrannize women, they wouldn't give them impunity. They'd actually treat them like they treated the slaves, and they just increase their crime sentences for committing crimes. They wouldn't give them impunity, nor would they make it a husband's responsibility to prevent his wife, from committing crimes. What isn't really mentioned in this specific passage is that the marriage laws are actually fairly even for both men and women. While women had a promise to obedience to her husband, the husband also very much had a promise of obedience to his wife. He was the financial obligations, which it never mentions, of course, because that would completely destroy this entire document, were all expected from the man to the wife. And if the man did not fulfill the wife's agreed upon bargain, or if the wife felt like the husband was harming her in any way, she had absolute legal recompense to bring him to the court and sue him. It doesn't, of course, get into this, but that's just withdrawal of information. And the withdrawal of information, as it's pretty prevalent in this document, when you bring up the laws that affected men historically, they were often quite similar to the laws that affected women. So moving on to next point, he has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be the proper cause of divorce in case of separation, to whom the guardianship of children shall be given, as to be holy, regardless of the happiness of the woman, the law in all cases going upon a false supposition of the supremacy of a man and giving all power into his hand. I largely see this as an insane dramatization of the laws of divorce. Again, especially when you read counter narratives to this, there's no way that men had all the power in divorce. There are many women who manage to utilize the divorce system when it comes to, say, abandoning their husbands and leaving them, and then coming back and suing them for alimony, or suing them for improper maintenance, or divorcing their husbands. And it specifically mentions, I do believe, in some of the other texts that I've read, that in divorce, the woman's property was actually completely protected from any search and seizure. So, again, if women are getting this incredibly raw deal in divorce, and this is not even bringing up the children part, which is something that makes today's age feminists kind of a little bit ridiculous. But just in the historical text of what this document is claiming, it's to say that men have the entirety of the power of divorce is absurd. It's utterly absurd, and an insane dramatization of what happens in divorce. So on the subject of children, historically the patriarchy, if you want to call it that, gave the children to the fathers. That's what they're referencing in this text. That under the legal document, which doesn't actually mean that fathers are the ones who always get custody. All it means is that in any divorce situation, which divorce was incredibly rare, and if you were going to be frank, the patriarchy is far more about saying that divorce should never happen at all, that you should stay together for your kids, far less about who gets the children in divorce. That's kind of like an afterthought. But if you're discussing patriarchy and its views on de facto who should get the children in divorce, they actually gave it to fathers. So when feminists today say that the laws or the patriarchal society believes that women are just the better caregivers, that is a false assertion on its face. That actually wasn't even anything anyone believed at the time. And I do highly suspect, from what I've heard from people that and what I've read, that the reason that they gave the children to fathers is because all the financial obligation was placed on the father as well. And none of the financial obligation was placed on the mother. There was no legal obligation, even if the woman made more money than the husband, which was something that was possible at this time frame. then they still would not have any legal recourse or legal action to take against a woman who does not take care of her children. Whereas if a father did not take care of his child, they had far more legal options. Of course, while feminism came in and they changed all of this, so they made it specifically a mother system that was part of the tender years doctrine, which was something that they changed in the time frame of before they obtained the vote, because no one listens to what they have to say at all, and women were just so poorly oppressed. They did not change any obligations that women had to the children. They still kept all the obligations with the father, and that's the reason why child support looks the way it does now, is because ultimately they just said the father should still be the one who's financially responsible for taking care of the child, but he does not actually need to see his child. He does not actually need to have any communication with his child whatsoever. All he needs to be is a paycheck, which, if they were so pro-equality and so pro-equalism, then they would have made it actually equal, which they never did, and certainly not only never did, but never advocated as if it was something that they should ever do. Moving on to the next point, after depriving her of all rights as a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. This is a slimy way of basically saying that men pay all the taxes on the woman's property when she's married. This is also in reference to the earlier point where they say he has taken from her all right and property, even to the wages she earns. They're essentially saying ultimately that when she's married, that the property that she owns, which it's still her property, as is pointed out in several other texts that I have read, which I will get to, that when she's married, the husband is the one who's seen as the legal custodian of the woman's property. And the reason that is because he's responsible for paying for all of the debts and the maintenance and the taxes on that property, which it's why it's a slimy way of saying these. What she's saying is essentially she's neglecting to mention the fact that it's not like she doesn't pay taxes when she's married on her property. It's the husband pays taxes on her property while she's married. But again, they don't mention this. They don't mention that under the law, it's actually a right that women have, that the property that they own is rightful, is according to the law supposed to be maintained by the man, and that includes the taxes. So it's not like she doesn't pay taxes when she's married. Well, it is like she doesn't pay taxes when she's married. It's just not her. It's her husband. And to continue on that line, she's essentially saying that when she's single, she's responsible for paying taxes. Which, yes, because if she would be married, it would be somebody else who'd be responsible for paying taxes on the property that she owns, because she's not restricted from owning property. That's not a thing that, like, the government does not seize her property because she's single, and nobody says that women are not allowed to own property because they're single or because they're married. It is ultimately their real complaint boils down to, when we're married, somebody else has to maintain our property. Which they never changed, by the way. They never changed the idea that men have to maintain the property. There were men who were being taken to jail for improperly maintaining property that they had no ability to maintain. But the problem was that men on the legal documents were recognized as the quote owners of said property, and that was unfair. Not the fact that men were supposed to maintain it. That they never really cared about that. Next point, he has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives but a scanty remuneration. This one, I'll be honest, I haven't heard too much about this one in anything that I've read. I really don't know much about it. When they say profitable employments, that's a pretty vague descriptor, but I'm not really sure one way or the other how that one aligned itself historically. He closes against her all the avenues to wealth and distinction which he considers most honorable to himself. As a teacher of theology, medicine, or law, she is not known. I find this rather funny. This also goes to one of their next points, which is he has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed to her. While they were writing this, the first woman to graduate from college was actually already in college and graduated next year. She graduated in 1849. This document was written in 1848. It's pretty logical to assume that she was already in college and graduating from college before they ever even made this complaint. I do also have to point out, historically, the concepts that they're discussing, the college systems, almost no one went to college. At this time frame, no one went to, these were like highly upper class ideals. They're not what most lower class people went through. Most men never went through college. Most men were never in any of these systems. And there's no evidence of them complaining about how there's primarily men who are getting black lung disease or working in coal mines, and it's still this way today. They're not really worried about the fact that it's men who are shoveling shit out of sewers, or constantly working in the hot sun, laying railroad tracks, or digging up oil. They don't really seem to have much of a problem with that one. But of course, if you don't have 50-50 representation in colleges, or in law, or in medicine, or something that is largely non-threatening and monetarily successful, then you are a complete bigot. He allows her in church as well as state, but a subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority for her exclusion from the ministry, and with some exceptions from any public participation in the affairs of the church. So I kind of find this rather weird, because if she's allowed in, because it does mention that she's allowed in state, which they said earlier that that wasn't something that was allowed. They actually, while I didn't get into point 2, it says he has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. However, she is allowed in state. I don't know how she would be allowed in state and also have no voice in the state. However, even now on the subject of the church does have already specific and present laws, and the next 3 points are pretty much the same thing. They're discussing the church and women's role in the church, and I do find that kind of interesting, because ultimately the Bible has quite a bit of statements about the roles of both men and women, and it says those pretty explicitly. And if you have a problem with that, then that seems like you have a problem with the belief system, not a problem with men. So I don't know what they think they're actually complaining about, but it more sounds like they're not really Christian, but they want to call themselves Christian and claim that Christianity should change to suit their needs, as opposed to just saying that they don't believe in the Bible, which would be far more accurate. So that is the full, because I'm not going to read the rest of the 3 document or specific points that are just about the church, because there's no point. They just basically repeat themselves 3 times over. Going to the closing remarks, it says, now in view of this entire disenfranchisement of 1/2 of the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, which they did not actually mention a single law. What I mean when I say that they haven't really referenced a single law is that while they discuss laws in an abstract, they don't discuss laws in any concrete way. They describe laws, they describe what they think the effects of those laws are, but they don't ever actually give me a law that I can look up. They don't give me anything that I can reference. So there's that. And because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States, and entering upon the great work before us, We anticipate no small amount of misconceptions, misrepresentations, and ridicule, but we shall use every instrument within our power to effect our object. We shall employ agents, circulate tracts, petition the state and national legislators, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit and press on our behalf. We hope this convention will be followed by a series of conventions embracing every part of the country. The next book that I'm going to do, just to kind of make this seem as stupid as possible, is a book called Shame and the Anti-Feminist Backlash that is attempting to explain why there are so many women who didn't like feminism. And I'm talking about women in the first wave, not just in the second wave or the third wave. There are so many women, and in fact more women than women who are for it, that were opposed to feminism. Because this is just an outright lie. If women felt themselves so aggrieved and oppressed and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, it would not be primarily women who were opposed to what they had to say.